Dawson sat alone at a corner table in the restaurant, glancing nervously at his watch. The quiet murmur of voices around him felt distant as he rehearsed what he'd planned to say. Tonight was supposed to be a fresh start. He'd been married to Morgan for 23 years, and like any long marriage, there's had seen highs and lows. But he'd planned this evening, this surprise dinner, hoping it might rekindle something between them. His heart quickened when he saw Morgan walking toward him. But she wasn't alone. Morgan walked in with a confident, almost arrogant expression, her hand resting lightly on the arm of his best friend, Carter. Dawson's smile faltered as he tried to process what he was seeing. Carter caught his eye, offering a slight smirk, and nodded casually, like this was the most natural thing in the world. Morgan Carter? Dawson's voice was filled with confusion. What's going on? I thought. His words trailed off as he glanced between them, searching for any hint that this was a joke, some elaborate prank. Morgan didn't say anything at first. Instead, she walked over, pulled out a chair across from Dawson, and sat down, still holding Carter's arm. She looked him squarely in the eye and tossed a thick stack of papers onto the table, pushing them toward him. Dawson frowned, looking down. Divorce papers. His heart pounded as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. He looked up at her, bewildered. What is this? He managed to ask, his voice barely more than a whisper. Morgan crossed her arms, her face cold and indifferent. It's exactly what it looks like, Dawson. Here are the divorce papers. I moved everything we saved from our joint account into my personal account, she said, each word cutting into him. She paused, letting the information sink in before delivering the final blow. I don't need you anymore, Dawson. You're a loser. I'm done with this life. Dawson's jaw dropped. The room seemed to spin around him. What do you mean, Morgan? We have a life together. We have kids. And Carter. He turned to his friend, feeling the sting of betrayal from two directions. Carter shrugged, a smug grin on his face. Things happen, Dawson. People grow apart. You've been so busy with work, barely noticing what's going on around you. Morgan and I, well, we found something real together. Dawson's mind raced. Memories flashed of times he'd confided in Carter about his worries, the struggles he and Morgan had been facing. Had Carter been manipulating him all along? Every time he'd offered advice, pretending to be supportive, it had all been a lie. Morgan glanced at her watch, clearly impatient. He's my future now, Dawson. I'm leaving tonight with him, starting with a romantic honeymoon. By the way, you can keep the kids, she added dismissively, her tone as casual as if she were handing him a shopping list. Keep the kids? Dawson repeated, feeling the weight of her words. His 3 children, who'd be home right now, likely waiting for him and Morgan to return. She was abandoning them too? Morgan's expression softened, but it wasn't sympathy. It was pity, the kind that made Dawson's stomach twist. I'm not cut out for this life anymore, Dawson. I want excitement, passion, things you just can't give me. Carter chuckled, throwing an arm around her shoulders. Face it, Dave. You're holding her back. It's been over for a long time. We're just the ones honest enough to do something about it. Dawson felt anger bubbling up inside him, but the shock and betrayal pinned him to his chair. He looked between them, struggling to find words. Morgan, we've built a life together. 23 years. You're just throwing it all away. Morgan's face remained unmoved. I deserve to be happy, Dawson. I don't owe you anything. Dawson's hands clenched as he tried to steady his voice. And the kids? Our family? Carter rolled his eyes. Don't make this more dramatic than it needs to be. She doesn't want that life anymore. She's with me now. Morgan looked at him with an amused smirk. Yeah, Dawson, why don't you stop being so dramatic? It's not like you didn't see this coming. He stared at her, feeling the disbelief melting into raw anger. You think you can just walk away from everything, Morgan? Our savings? Our family? Of course I can. And I already have, she replied smoothly, shrugging her shoulders as if brushing off an inconvenience. Dawson could feel his world shattering around him, piece by piece. This wasn't the woman he thought he knew. He'd spent years believing they were building something, believing he was providing a good life for her and the kids. He thought they were a team, weathering the ups and downs together. But she'd turned everything they had into a lie. Morgan rose from her chair, tugging Carter to his feet as well. I don't have time for a dramatic farewell, Dawson. Carter and I have a flight to catch. She picked up her purse, gave him one last indifferent look, and added, "Goodbye." With that, she walked out, Carter by her side, their laughter echoing back into the restaurant. Dawson sat there, paralyzed, as the reality settled on him like a heavy weight. He felt numb, unable to move or think, as he stared at the divorce papers lying on the table, each page a cruel reminder of the life they'd built that she'd casually dismantled. Around him, the restaurant buzzed with quiet chatter, clinking glasses, and soft music, but it all felt distant. He was left alone, surrounded by strangers, his life splintered in a single evening. Dawson sat alone in the darkened living room, the silence pressing down on him. He glanced around, taking in the framed photos on the walls, the family vacations, the smiles that felt like lies now. His eyes settled on a photo of him and Morgan, arms wrapped around each other, laughing. That was their 15th anniversary trip to the lake. They'd promised each other, under the stars, that they'd always make it work, no matter what. His hands tightened around the frame, memories crashing over him. He remembered the nights Morgan would come home late, saying she had to stay back at work. She'd brush him off when he asked if everything was okay, calling him paranoid. "Dawson, relax. It's just work." She'd laugh it off, but now he saw her evasiveness in a new light. His mind flashed to the past, to the warmth of her touch, the way she used to look at him with love. Their wedding day, the promises they made, the hope they'd shared. He'd been there through every milestone, every joy, and every struggle. Then came another memory, one that twisted the knife deeper. It was a barbecue 3 summers ago. Carter had brought over a bottle of wine, and they'd spent the evening laughing in the backyard. At one point, after Morgan had gone inside to check on the kids, Carter had clapped a hand on Dawson's shoulder. "You're like a brother to me," he'd said, eyes earnest, or so it seemed. "There's no one I trust more." Dawson's stomach churned at the memory. "Brother," he muttered bitterly. All those times Carter pretended to be there for him, listening to his fears, offering advice. It was all a show. Every smile, every word of encouragement, it was all part of his deceit. Dawson shook his head, snapping back to the present. He reached for his laptop on the coffee table, opened it, and logged into their bank account. His chest tightened as he reviewed the transactions. There it was, staring back at him. Morgan had moved nearly everything into her own account, leaving him with barely enough to cover a month's expenses. A wave of anger and betrayal surged through him. 23 years together, and she'd stolen from him as easily as if he were a stranger. He could barely breathe as he absorbed the extent of her betrayal. Just then, the doorbell rang, jolting him from his thoughts. He got up, unsure of who could be visiting at this hour. Opening the door, he found Ashton, an old friend from work, standing there, concern written across his face. "Hey, Dave," Ashton said, eyeing him carefully. "I heard about the divorce. I wanted to check on you." Dawson tried to muster a smile, but failed. "Come in, Ashton," he murmured, stepping aside. Ashton entered, glancing around the dimly lit room. "You look like you haven't slept in days." Dawson gave a hollow laugh. "I feel like I haven't. Everything's a mess, Ashton." "Morgan," he trailed off, swallowing hard. "She left me for Carter. My best friend. They've been planning this for months, maybe longer." Ashton's eyes widened. "Carter? Are you serious?" Dawson nodded, sinking back onto the couch. "She took everything, drained our accounts, left me with the kids, walked away like we were nothing." Ashton sat beside him, his voice low. "I had no idea it was this bad. I knew you were going through a rough patch, but—" He shook his head, unable to finish. Dawson ran a hand over his face. "I feel like such a fool, Ashton. I trusted her. I trusted him. All those times he listened to me vent about our marriage, he was just using it to his advantage." Ashton placed a hand on Dawson's shoulder, his voice gentle but firm. "Listen, Dave, none of this is your fault. People like them, they're selfish. They don't think about the destruction they leave behind. They just take what they want." Dawson stared at the floor, his voice barely a whisper. "She was with him all along, wasn't she? Right under my nose, and I didn't see it." Ashton sighed. "You saw what you wanted to see, Dave. You believed in her. In your marriage. That's not something to be ashamed of. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the betrayal hanging between them. Dawson felt the enormity of it pressing down on him, suffocating him. Finally, he spoke, his voice steadier. I don't know what to do, Ashton. I built my whole life around her, around our family. And now, she's just gone. Ashton looked at him, his expression thoughtful. You're still a father, Dave. The kids need you now more than ever. Morgan may have given up, but you don't have to. Dawson nodded, feeling a flicker of purpose. He thought of his children, how they'd be feeling lost and confused. They needed someone to hold them together, and he realized that person had to be him. Ashton gave him a reassuring pat on the back. I know this isn't what you wanted, but maybe it's time to focus on what you do have. You have your kids, your own strength. You don't need her. Dawson's jaw tightened, determination starting to replace the despair. You're right. I have to be there for them. They deserve better than this. Better than her. Ashton smiled, a faint glimmer of relief in his eyes. That's the Dawson I know. And if there's anything I can do, anything, you let me know. You don't have to go through this alone. Dawson felt a surge of gratitude. He wasn't alone. Despite the betrayal, he still had people who cared about him, who believed in him. He'd lost Morgan, but maybe he hadn't lost everything. As Ashton left, Dawson stood by the door for a moment, taking in the quiet of the house. The pain of Morgan's betrayal still lingered, sharp and unrelenting, but for the first time, he felt a sense of resolve. This was his home, and he would fight to keep it. He would fight for his children, for the life they deserved. He walked back to the living room, picking up the photo of him and Morgan, and placed it face down on the table. She'd made her choice, and now he had to make his. Dawson sat in Rachel's office, his gaze wandering to the shelves lined with thick law books and framed diplomas. He hadn't been here in years, and certainly never under circumstances like these. He looked down at the manila folder he held, the one filled with the divorce papers Morgan had casually tossed at him just 2 nights ago. Rachel entered the room, her professional demeanor softened by a warm smile. She had always been a friend, someone who'd listened to his stories about Morgan with a knowing look. Now, though, that familiarity held an edge. She was here as his ally. Hey, Dawson, she greeted, her eyes narrowing as she sat across from him. I heard about Morgan. I'm sorry you're going through this. Her voice was steady but gentle. Dawson swallowed, struggling to find the right words. Thanks, Rachel. I didn't know who else to turn to. She just left, took everything from our account, threw divorce papers in my face, and left me with the kids. His voice cracked, the weight of the betrayal pressing down on him. Rachel leaned forward, brows knitted. And she thinks she can just take off like this? With your money, no less. She shook her head, clearly disturbed. Dawson slid the folder across the desk to her. She made it very clear she's done. All that talk about how I could keep the kids, she thinks they're a burden, Rachel. But they're my reason to fight now. Rachel nodded, flipping through the papers. Good. You're going to need that strength. She looked up, her eyes holding a fierce determination. Dawson, don't sign these. Not yet. We need time to look into this more closely. Dawson looked at her, confused. But she already took the money, Rachel. Isn't it too late? Not necessarily, she replied, tapping a pen against the papers. There are laws, protections in place. She can't just run off with everything and expect to get away with it. That joint account was built from both of your earnings. Half of that money is yours, and we're going to get it back. Dawson felt a glimmer of hope as Rachel continued. If she thinks she can leave you with all the responsibility and waltz off with your best friend, she's mistaken. Abandoning you and the kids won't play well in court, especially with the financial mess she's left behind. He watched her as she spoke, feeling both gratitude and something else, an old warmth he hadn't acknowledged in years. Rachel had always been supportive, even during his rocky moments with Morgan. He remembered late nights years ago when they'd meet for coffee and she'd listen to his frustrations about his marriage. She'd never spoken badly of Morgan, but she'd been honest with him in a way few people had. Rachel leaned back, her gaze intense. Here's what we're going to do. We'll file a motion to freeze the remaining funds and demand a full financial audit. We'll look into the transfers Morgan made, See if there's any chance of reversing them. Dawson nodded, the plan slowly sinking in. But will that work? She's already moved the money out. And Carter, well, he has his own resources. Rachel smirked, the glint in her eye returning. It's not going to be easy, but Morgan and Carter underestimated you, Dave. They assumed you'd just roll over. But we're going to make them understand that actions have consequences. Dawson's gaze fell, his hands clenching on the edge of the desk. I trusted them both, Rachel. I thought, his voice caught. I thought we were a family. I don't understand how it could all fall apart so fast. Rachel reached across the desk, her hand resting on his. It didn't fall apart overnight, Dave. You were just the last to see it because you're a good person. You were committed, even when Morgan wasn't. Dawson looked up at her, surprised by the steadiness in her gaze. You really think we can win this? He asked, a note of vulnerability slipping into his voice. She squeezed his hand gently before pulling hers back. I know we can. You may not see it now, but you're not powerless. You still have your kids, and you still have a lot of rights here. The court will take into account her abandonment, especially if she left you with all the responsibilities. The strength in Rachel's words started to stir something inside him, a flicker of resolve he hadn't felt since Morgan's betrayal. Thank you, Rachel. I don't know what I would have done without you. Rachel softened, her professional demeanor slipping as she offered a small smile. It's what friends are for. And, well, I'd be lying if I said I didn't take a little pleasure in knocking Morgan down a few pegs. What she did to you, it's unforgivable. They shared a moment of silence, both of them lost in their thoughts. For Dawson, it was a realization that he still had people in his corner. Rachel wasn't just his lawyer. She was someone who genuinely cared about him, who believed in him. Rachel cleared her throat, breaking the silence. Listen, Dave, there's something else we need to discuss. Morgan didn't just abandon you and the kids. She left you with a mountain of responsibilities. And the court is going to look favorably on that. But you need to be prepared. This isn't going to be quick or easy. Are you up for it? Dawson nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle on him. I have to be, Rachel. I can't let her and Carter walk away like this. Not after what they've done. My kids deserve better. She leaned forward, her voice softening. And so do you. The words hit him with unexpected force, and he looked up, meeting her eyes. There was something there, something he hadn't seen in a long time. A quiet warmth, a support that went beyond friendship. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Rachel broke the silence, returning to her professional tone. I'll start filing the paperwork right away. And Dave, if you ever need to talk, outside of all this legal mess, I'm here. Dawson nodded, a slight smile playing at his lips. Thank you, Rachel. Really, I don't know how I'd be handling any of this if it weren't for you. Rachel stood up, gathering the papers and giving him a reassuring nod. We're going to get through this, Dave. And when it's over, you'll have a fresh start. Just take things one day at a time. As Dawson left her office, a sense of determination replaced the anger and confusion he'd felt earlier. For the first time since Morgan's betrayal, he felt like he was beginning to regain control. He had an ally in Rachel, someone who wasn't just fighting for him legally, but who genuinely cared about his well-being. And as he walked out of her office, he realized that maybe, just maybe, this betrayal wasn't the end of everything. It could be the beginning of something new. Late at night, Dawson sat alone in his study, his eyes scanning the cluttered surface of his desk. Old photo albums, framed pictures, and crumpled receipts lay scattered before him. Each item was a reminder of a life he once cherished and people he once trusted. He reached for a picture of him and Morgan from a family vacation, and beside it, one of him and Carter from a fishing trip. Memories that now felt tarnished, tainted by lies. He flipped through one of Morgan's old purses, feeling absurdly out of place rummaging through her things, but he was desperate. He needed answers. There, tucked into a side pocket, he found it, a hotel receipt from a place in town. Dawson felt his stomach drop as he read the date. 2 months ago, the weekend Morgan had claimed she was at a work retreat. His hands shook as he looked closer, and his heart hammered as he found another receipt from just a few weeks before that, at a different hotel. The realization hit him hard, his voice barely a whisper. They'd been planning this for months. A string of memories rushed back to him. Morgan coming home late, brushing him off with excuses, her gaze elsewhere during family dinners, her phone face down on the table whenever she was around him. He felt his anger rising, along with a sickening sense of betrayal. How had he been so blind? He opened her old laptop, hoping to find more evidence, and within minutes, he uncovered a string of cryptic messages between Morgan and Carter. He read each one, piecing together the timeline of their affair. The messages ranged from casual greetings to long conversations filled with laughter and more private exchanges that made his skin crawl. Scrolling further, he found a thread discussing their honeymoon plans, a luxury cruise, a 2-week trip through Europe, all funded by the money she'd taken from their joint account. They'd been planning to start a new life, leaving him and the kids behind without a second thought. Dawson clenched his fists, the betrayal sinking in. "They thought they could just throw me away," he muttered bitterly, the rage bubbling within him. "As if I were nothing." But then another thought struck him, a realization that began to take shape, fueled by his fury. If Morgan and Carter thought they'd escape unscathed, then maybe it was time they learned what consequences felt like. His mind started to race, plotting. If they wanted a honeymoon so badly, he could give them one they'd never forget. Without hesitating, he reached for his phone and dialed Rachel's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice calm but curious. "Dawson? It's late. What's going on?" He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I found proof, Rachel. Receipts, messages, everything. They've been together for months, and they took the money for some big honeymoon trip." There was a brief silence before Rachel responded, her tone hardening. "So they didn't even try to cover their tracks. That only strengthens our case." Dawson's voice took on a determined edge. "Rachel, I don't want them to walk away from this without consequences. I want them to suffer for what they did." Rachel's voice softened, but he could hear the same fierce resolve. "They will, Dawson, but you have to be careful. Revenge is tempting, but this needs to be handled legally. If we go about it the right way, they'll pay for everything." Dawson hesitated, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm ready, Rachel. Let's make them regret every second of this." She paused, considering his words. "First, we'll go after the money. You have the right to claim half of the funds she took, maybe even more. And with the proof you've found, we can argue that her actions were premeditated. It'll help our case to show that she used marital assets to fund an affair." "Good," Dawson replied, his anger sharpening his focus. "But I want more than the money. I want them to feel what it's like to be abandoned, to lose everything they thought they'd get." Rachel's voice held a note of caution. "We'll keep it above board, Dawson. But I promise, we'll make this painful for them. She didn't just betray you, she abandoned her family. The court will take that seriously." They spent the next hour going over the plan, strategizing every step. Rachel outlined the steps for freezing the remaining assets, initiating a formal complaint against Morgan for abandoning the kids, and filing for primary custody. "We'll paint the full picture in court," she explained. "Her actions will have consequences. And Carter, well, his involvement complicates things for them both." After they wrapped up, Dawson hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, his mind still reeling. He felt a strange sense of satisfaction, imagining the shock on Morgan and Carter's faces when they realized they couldn't just walk away from their mess. In a sudden fit of energy, Dawson went to his garage, gathering old memorabilia, pictures of him and Morgan, anniversary gifts, even the mementos she'd given him over the years. He tossed them into a box, shutting the lid firmly. As he carried it out to the trash bin, he felt a strange release, like shedding a heavy skin that had held him back for far too long. Back inside, he poured himself a glass of water and looked around, taking in the silence of the house. For the first time since Morgan's betrayal, he felt something besides grief. It was a sense of purpose, of determination. He picked up the photo of him and the kids from last summer, the day they'd spent at the amusement park, riding roller coasters and laughing until their sides hurt. He smiled, feeling warmth in his chest. Morgan might have left them, but his kids were still here. They were his reason to move forward, to fight. He placed the photo back on the shelf, taking a deep breath as he steadied himself. Ashton Oro, he would sit down with his kids, explaining as best he could what had happened, reassuring them that they still had a family, no matter what Morgan had done. He owed them that honesty and that comfort. Dawson's phone buzzed, a message from Rachel. Got everything filed. Let's stay the course. Don't let them see you sweat. He replied simply, "Thank you, Rachel. I'm ready." As he turned off the light in his study, he felt a weight lifting. He wasn't alone in this. With Rachel's help and the strength he'd found within himself, he would make it through. Dawson sat in Rachel's office, leaning forward as he outlined his plan, his voice steady. The anger that had once made his voice tremble was now a cold determination. Rachel listened carefully, nodding at intervals, her expression both approving and cautious. "So first," Dawson began, tapping his fingers on the desk, "we need to make sure she's locked out of anything she hasn't touched yet. Every cent that she thinks she has access to, we need to make sure it's out of reach." Rachel nodded. "Already on it. The court granted a temporary freezing order on your accounts this morning. If she tries to access anything, she'll be in for a rude surprise." A small, satisfied smile spread across Dawson's face. "Good. I want her to feel the weight of what she's done. She took our life savings without a second thought. Now she's going to learn what it feels like to have everything taken from her." Rachel leaned back in her chair, her eyes sharp. "This is only the start, Dawson. I know freezing the accounts might seem like a small victory, but it's a critical move. This buys us time to gather more evidence and ensure the court see her for who she really is." Dawson's smile faded as he thought of Morgan and Carter's betrayal. "Rachel, I've been looking into some things on my end, too," he said, his tone dark. "Carter's business has some skeletons in the closet. I think it's time his clients find out who they're really dealing with." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "You found something?" "I have a friend in accounting," Dawson said, his eyes gleaming. "We went over some of Carter's recent contracts. Turns out he's been cutting corners, billing clients for services they didn't receive, inflating costs. His clients won't be happy to learn where their money's been going." Rachel leaned forward, her interest piqued. "If you expose his dealings, you'll hit him where it hurts, their honeymoon fund. But be careful. If it's traced back to you, it could complicate things legally." Dawson shrugged, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not looking for revenge through any illegal means. I'll make sure everything's anonymous. I just want his clients to know the truth." Rachel smiled approvingly. "Then let's make it happen." The next day, Dawson spent hours creating anonymous emails, carefully wording each one to avoid direct accusations, but containing just enough evidence to raise suspicion. He sent a handful of messages to some of Carter's biggest clients, attaching files that hinted at discrepancies and unethical practices. As he hit send on the last one, a weight lifted from his shoulders. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about exposing the truth and making them face the consequences. Later that evening, Rachel called him with an update. "So, I just got word from the court. Morgan tried accessing your account earlier today. Looks like she panicked when she realized her funds were frozen." Dawson grinned, a sense of satisfaction filling him. "She probably thought she'd outsmarted me, but she's starting to see how wrong she was. Just don't get too comfortable," Rachel warned, though her tone was light. "Morgan's resourceful, and Carter, well, he's a snake. They'll fight back. Be ready." Dawson nodded, grateful for her guidance. "Thanks, Rachel." "For everything." Rachel hesitated, her voice softening. "I told you, Dave. I'm here for you, whatever it takes." The following morning, Dawson received a call from one of his old friends, Tyler, who was a contractor for one of Carter's clients. "Hey, Dave," Tyler began, sounding curious. "I just got a strange email about Carter. I know he's your friend, but what's going on with him? It sounds like he's been up to some shady stuff." Dawson kept his voice neutral, not wanting to reveal too much. "Tyler, I thought you deserved to know. It seems Carter's been taking advantage of his clients. I figured you want to be careful." Tyler let out a low whistle. "Wow, I never would have guessed. Thanks for the heads up. I'll be sure to spread the word." After the call, Dawson sat back, feeling the satisfaction of watching his plan unfold. Carter's professional reputation, carefully crafted over years, was starting to unravel. Clients would be furious, and that would hit his business and his finances hard. That evening, he received a text from Rachel. "Got word from one of my contacts. Morgan and Carter's little honeymoon fund is being drained faster than they planned. Carter's facing a lot of angry clients. And Morgan, well, she's completely locked out of your accounts. He texted back, perfect. They wanted my money for their dreams. Let's make sure they have to spend every cent they have just to get out of debt. The next day, Rachel called him into her office. I have one more idea, she said, her expression thoughtful. If you're willing to go through with it. What do you have in mind? He asked, intrigued. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. If we play our cards right, we can file a formal complaint against Morgan for abandonment and fraud. Since she left you with the kids and wiped the account, it could strengthen your case in court. Dawson's eyes lit up. You think the court will go for it? With everything she's done, it's a real possibility, Rachel said. But we'll need solid evidence. If you can get a hold of any documents that show she transferred the money intending to leave, that would seal it. He thought back to the messages he'd found between her and Carter, especially the ones detailing their escape plan. I have some text between them, he said slowly. Would that be enough? Rachel nodded. It's a start. If the court sees that she planned all of this, it'll work in our favor. As they discussed the finer points of the plan, Dawson felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was no longer just about hurting Morgan and Carter. It was about setting things right, ensuring that they faced the consequences of their actions. A few days later, Dawson received another call from Tyler, who sounded amused. Looks like Carter's in deep trouble, Dave. His clients are pulling out left and right. It's like watching a house of cards fall. Dawson grinned. I can't say I'm surprised. He's been cutting corners for years. Guess it finally caught up with him. As the week unfolded, Dawson received more and more updates from Rachel about Morgan's and Carter's deteriorating situation. Morgan had tried contacting him, sending desperate emails and voicemails. But he ignored each one, letting her feel the weight of her actions. She'd wanted freedom, and now she was facing it, without his money, and without the support she'd assumed she'd have. Rachel called him one last time that week. They're on the ropes, Dave. You've done it. He took a deep breath, feeling the satisfaction sink in. Thanks, Rachel. I don't know how I would have done any of this without you. It's not over yet, she reminded him, though he could hear the pride in her voice. But you're in control now. Just keep pushing forward. As Dawson hung up, he felt a surge of energy. He had regained control over his life, and Morgan and Carter were now feeling the consequences of their betrayal. He wasn't the same man they'd discarded so easily. He'd found a new strength, one that would carry him forward without them. The lobby of the luxury hotel glowed in soft amber light, music humming softly through the speakers as couples and families bustled about, savoring the joy of vacation. Morgan and Carter strolled toward the front desk, Morgan holding her phone and purse with a smug smile, as if life had finally aligned in her favor. She approached the receptionist with confidence, sliding a sleek card across the counter. Checking in, she said, glancing over her shoulder at Carter, who smirked as he adjusted his expensive suit. Honeymoon suite. The receptionist scanned her card, tapped a few keys, and then frowned at the screen. I'm sorry, ma'am. It appears there's an issue with the payment. Morgan's brow furrowed. What do you mean an issue? Run it again. We're staying in the honeymoon suite. The receptionist nodded and swiped the card a second time, the frown deepening as she studied the screen. It's showing as declined, ma'am. Do you have another form of payment? Carter's confidence cracked, and he leaned toward Morgan, his voice low. What's going on? You said you moved everything. We're supposed to have more than enough. Morgan's fingers fumbled in her purse, retrieving a second card. Her heart beat faster as she handed it over. Try this one, she insisted, forcing a smile at the receptionist. The woman swiped the card, paused, and then shook her head, her voice laced with apologetic concern. I'm sorry, ma'am, but this card has also been declined. A chill ran down Morgan's spine. That's impossible, she muttered, half to herself. She shot a quick look at Carter, whose face had turned a shade darker. Maybe it's just a temporary issue with the bank. Carter wasn't buying it. You told me you cleared out the account, Morgan. Every cent. So why aren't any of these cards working? Morgan's hands shook as she tried to smile, but panic set in as she glanced at the crowd around them. Lower your voice, Carter. Let's handle this calmly, she hissed. She turned back to the receptionist. Please, can we just put it on hold while I call the bank? We've traveled a long way, and we're here for a special occasion." The receptionist hesitated, then nodded, her polite smile unwavering. "Of course, ma'am. I'll hold the reservation, but I'll need confirmation of payment by tomorrow morning." "Thank you," Morgan replied, forcing a smile. Carter tugged her aside, his voice dripping with frustration. "This better be fixed by tomorrow, Morgan. I didn't give up everything to come here and look like a fool." Morgan's hand was clammy as she clutched her phone, stepping away from the crowded lobby to call her bank. She listened to the automated voice, entering the numbers and waiting for a representative, her stomach twisting with anxiety. "Thank you for calling. How can I assist you today?" the bank representative said in a cheery voice. "Yes, I'd like to understand why my cards aren't working," Morgan replied, trying to keep her tone steady. "I moved funds from a joint account to my personal one, but it seems I can't access them." "Let me check that for you," the representative said, and Morgan waited, tapping her foot as her anxiety grew. Finally, the representative returned with an answer that struck her like a blow to the chest. "It appears there's been a temporary hold placed on the funds, pending further investigation." Morgan's heart pounded. "What? Why?" "Due to the nature of the transfer and the fact that it was from a joint account, it seems there's a court order on hold," the representative continued, her tone neutral. "For now, the funds are frozen. You'll need to contact the account co-owner or your legal representative for further assistance." Morgan's face turned white as she realized what this meant. Dawson. He'd retaliated. She hung up, her hands shaking as she turned to face Carter, who stared at her with an expression of pure fury. "Are you kidding me?" he snarled, his voice barely restrained. "You told me you had everything under control. You promised we'd be free of him." "Carter, She tried to find the words, but her mind was a blur of panic and guilt. She had been so sure Dawson would simply let her go, so sure he would never fight back. And now, here she was, halfway across the world, her safety net gone, her plans unraveling. Carter's eyes narrowed. "So, what now, Morgan? We're stuck here with no money. All because you thought he'd just roll over and let you take everything." Morgan's voice broke as she tried to explain. "I didn't think he'd do this, Carter. I didn't think he'd fight back." Carter scoffed, his tone cold and dismissive. "Well, maybe you should have thought harder before dragging me into this mess." "Wait, don't walk away," Morgan pleaded as he started to storm off, his shoulders tense with anger. But he ignored her, heading for the exit without a backward glance, leaving her standing alone in the lobby. Swallowing her pride, Morgan pulled out her phone and dialed Dawson's number. She bit her lip as it rang, feeling a flicker of hope mixed with the shame of what she was about to do. She never imagined she'd be calling him like this, begging for help, but there was no one else. The call went to voicemail. She tried again, waiting with bated breath, but it went unanswered. "Please, Dawson," she whispered into the phone, leaving a voicemail. I made a mistake. I know I hurt you, but please don't do this to me. Just give me access to some of the money. I can't even pay for a room tonight." There was no response. Morgan's heart sank as she realized he was ignoring her, letting her suffer the consequences of her choices. In a last, desperate attempt, she sent him a text, her fingers trembling as she typed, "Dawson, I'm sorry. I know I did wrong, but I need your help. Just this once. Please." She watched the message send, praying he'd answer, that he'd still have some kindness left for her. But as the minutes passed with no reply, the reality of her situation settled in. The weight of her choices pressed down on her. The lavish life she'd imagined with Carter was crumbling before her eyes. She could still hear Dawson's voice from months ago, back when they were still together, still pretending at happiness. He'd always been patient, kind, giving her the benefit of the doubt, never suspecting the betrayal that simmered beneath the surface. And now, here she was, cut off and alone, while the man she'd betrayed held all the cards. Taking a deep breath, Morgan turned away from the front desk, the warm lights of the lobby now seeming to mock her. She felt every pair of eyes in the room on her as she walked out into the cold night, clutching her phone, hoping for a miracle that would never come. It was late evening when Dawson heard him knock on his door. The house was quiet, his kids were already asleep, and the dim light from the kitchen cast a soft glow into the living room. Dawson felt a strange pang in his chest as he crossed the room. He had grown used to the silence, to this newfound loneliness. Opening the door, he found Rachel standing there, her face softened by the evening light. She held a bag of takeout and a bottle of wine, her eyes bright with a warmth that he hadn't seen in a long time. "Thought you might need some company tonight," she said with a gentle smile. "I know it's been rough." Dawson blinked, surprised, but managed a smile. "You didn't have to, Rachel. But, thank you." They moved to the living room, the familiar comfort of her presence settling the unease that had gripped him since Morgan's betrayal. As Rachel unpacked the food, she glanced around the room, eyes landing on a few family photos still on the shelves. There was a look in her eyes, one he couldn't quite place. They sat in comfortable silence, eating until Rachel finally broke it. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about you lately, Dave. About everything you've gone through." Dawson sighed, setting down his fork. "Honestly, I don't know what to feel anymore. Part of me wants to be angry, to let it consume me. But then I look at my kids, and I remember they're what matters now." Rachel reached across the table and placed a hand over his. Her touch was warm, grounding him in a way he hadn't expected. "You've been through so much. I can't imagine the hurt and betrayal. But I know you, Dave. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met." Dawson looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time. Rachel had been there through the aftermath, through the chaos of Morgan's departure, through the tough days when he had to navigate single fatherhood. She was a friend, yes, but something in her gaze tonight felt different, softer, more open. Rachel took a deep breath, and her voice was barely a whisper. "I don't want to overstep, but I've always admired you, Dave. The way you handled everything, the way you put your kids first, even when it hurt. You didn't deserve what Morgan did to you. And maybe," she hesitated, her fingers brushing against his, "maybe you deserve to find happiness again." Dawson's breath caught. He hadn't allowed himself to think about this, to even consider moving on. But Rachel's words stirred something in him, a faint glimmer of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. He realized just how much he valued her presence, her kindness, her steady support. "Rachel," he began, his voice raw with honesty, "I never saw this coming. I didn't think I'd be able to feel anything again, let alone something like this." Rachel's hand tightened around his. "I'm not saying it has to be anything, Dave, but I care about you, and I just want you to know, if you're ever ready, I'm here." A soft silence settled between them, filled with unspoken emotions. Dawson felt a lump in his throat, realizing how much her words meant to him. He didn't have to fight alone anymore. He had someone beside him, someone who genuinely cared. Slowly, Dawson raised her hand to his lips and kissed it softly, a small gesture of gratitude. "Thank you, Rachel, for everything. I'm still figuring things out, but I think I'm ready to let go of the past." Rachel's eyes shone with a gentle warmth as she looked at him, understanding his unspoken words. "You don't have to rush, Dave. I'll be here however long it takes." They sat close, the weight of the past still present but somehow less heavy with her by his side. It wasn't a grand, passionate moment. It was quiet, real, and exactly what he needed. As they talked about their lives, their struggles, and dreams, Dawson felt something inside him shift, a piece of his heart opening up. Hours passed, and the conversation drifted from deep confessions to light-hearted stories from their younger days. Rachel shared funny stories about her old college days, and Dawson found himself laughing in a way he hadn't in months. The laughter was healing, lifting the lingering pain he'd been carrying since that fateful night. "Remember when we all went camping?" Rachel chuckled, her eyes crinkling at the memory. "You tried to cook for everyone and nearly burned the whole campsite down." Dawson groaned, hiding his face. "I thought everyone had forgotten about that. Morgan always brought that up every chance she got." Rachel shook her head, smiling softly. "Well, I never forgot. You always tried so hard to make everyone happy. That's one of the things I admired about you, Dave. You never gave up on people." Dawson looked at her, his heart swelling with appreciation. He realized that in her quiet way, Rachel had been a constant in his life, even when he hadn't noticed. And now, for the first time, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, she could be more than that. They moved to the couch, the warm light casting shadows across the room as they settled side by side. Rachel leaned her head against his shoulder, and he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. "Rachel," he said softly, breaking the silence, "I know I haven't been the easiest person to be around lately. But being with you tonight, it's like I can finally breathe again." She smiled, tilting her head to look at him. "Dave, you've always been there for everyone else. Let someone be there for you, too. You don't have to carry it all alone." He nodded, grateful for her words, realizing how much he'd been holding on to: anger, regret, guilt. Slowly, he felt those feelings begin to fade, replaced by something new, something he didn't quite have words for yet. As the night deepened, they fell into a comfortable silence, her head resting against his shoulder as they both stared into the quiet darkness. For the first time since his world had been shattered, Dawson felt a sense of possibility. There, in the quiet moments with Rachel, he found hope, a chance to start again, to let someone truly see him for who he was. Rachel's voice broke the silence, soft and steady. "Dave, whatever happens, I want you to know that you deserve happiness. Real happiness. And if that means moving on, leaving everything behind, I'll be here for you." Dawson closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of her words settle over him like a balm. He didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, he knew he wasn't alone. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could find happiness again. Dawson was alone in his study, going through old documents he needed to sort out now that his life had taken a different direction. He was beginning to feel lighter, unburdened by the betrayals that once weighed him down. It was a steady, gradual process, but Rachel's presence had brought a new kind of peace. Then, there was a knock at the door. For a moment, Dawson hesitated. It was late, and he wasn't expecting anyone. He got up, walked to the front door, and opened it, only to see Morgan standing on the porch. She looked nothing like the confident woman he remembered from that fateful night at the restaurant. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hair disheveled, and her posture defeated. "Dave," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. Dawson held his silence, staring at her with an expression of calm detachment. She shifted uncomfortably, twisting her hands as though she didn't quite know how to start. "Please, can we talk?" she asked, her voice breaking. "I need to explain." He opened the door a bit wider, but didn't invite her in. Instead, he crossed his arms and leaned against the doorframe, waiting. Morgan took a shaky breath, her eyes filling with tears. "I made a mistake, Dave. I know that now," she stammered. I thought I could start over with Carter. I thought it was what I wanted, but I was wrong." She looked down, as though ashamed. "Carter left me as soon as things got hard. All those promises he made, none of them meant anything." Dawson didn't respond immediately, just watching her with an unreadable expression. Finally, he spoke, his tone cool and measured. "And now that things didn't work out, you're here, back at my doorstep?" Morgan flinched at his words. She reached out, her voice desperate. "Dave, please, I'm asking you to forgive me. We had years together, a life together. You know me better than anyone. Can't we start over?" Dawson looked at her, unblinking. "Start over?" He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Morgan, you didn't hesitate when you left. You threw away everything we had, everything I thought we shared, without a second thought. And now you want to pick up where we left off." Morgan's voice grew more desperate. "I was wrong, Dave. I was so wrong. I let myself believe that I deserved something more, something better, but you were the best thing in my life, and I didn't see it until it was too late." Dawson shook his head slowly, the weight of her words unable to move him. "You made a choice, Morgan. You left me. You took our money, and you abandoned our family. You got exactly what you wanted, a new life with Carter." Morgan's face crumpled as she sank to her knees on the porch, gripping her hands tightly as though she could hold herself together. "Please, Dave," she sobbed. "I have nothing left. Carter, he's gone. The money is gone. Everything fell apart. I know I hurt you, and I know I don't deserve anything from you, but please, I need you." Dawson felt a pang of sympathy, but he quickly pushed it aside. He'd spent too long carrying the pain of her betrayal to let it sway him now. "You need me?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. Morgan, you made it clear I was just an obstacle to you. You said you didn't need me, that I was holding you back. She looked up at him, her face a mess of tears and regret. I didn't know what I was saying. I was selfish. I thought only of myself, and I didn't realize what I was losing until it was gone. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I've lost everything, Dave. Please, just give me a chance to make things right. At that moment, Rachel came down the hall, her presence calm and steady. She placed a gentle hand on Dawson's shoulder, a silent show of support. Dawson glanced at her, and for the first time, he felt the full strength of what they shared. Unlike the hollow promises he'd once clung to with Morgan, this was real. Morgan's eyes widened as she noticed Rachel's hand resting on Dawson's shoulder, her face crumpling further as the realization hit her. You've moved on, she whispered, almost to herself. Dawson nodded slowly. Yes, Morgan, I have, and I finally understand what real respect and loyalty look like. I've found someone who values me for who I am, not just what I can give. He turned to Rachel, offering a small, grateful smile, and she squeezed his shoulder reassuringly. Morgan's desperation grew, and she reached out, clutching at Dawson's hand. Please, Dave, I'll do anything. I can change. I'll be the woman you deserve. Just don't leave me like this. Don't leave me with nothing. Dawson gently pulled his hand from hers, stepping back. Morgan, I didn't leave you with nothing. You chose to take everything you wanted. You walked away, laughing, thinking you'd won. Now, you're left with the consequences of your own choices. Morgan's face twisted with despair as she looked from Dawson to Rachel, seeing the quiet understanding between them. She let out a sob, fully realizing the finality of the situation. So that's it? You're done with me? Dawson met her gaze one last time, his eyes steady and resolved. I'm done, Morgan. I gave you everything I had, and you threw it away. I've forgiven you in my own way, but I can't give you a second chance. I've moved on, and it's time for you to do the same. Morgan's shoulders slumped, her face pale and defeated. She looked lost, her eyes searching his for a glimmer of hope, but finding none. She rose slowly, realizing there was nothing left to say, no plea that would change his mind. Rachel stepped forward, wrapping an arm around Dawson in a gesture that left no room for ambiguity. Let's go inside, Dave, she murmured, her voice gentle. As they turned to go back into the house, Morgan stood alone on the porch, watching them disappear into the warmth of the home she had once shared with him. The realization settled heavily on her shoulders. She had thrown away something real, something she would never get back. The door closed softly behind Dawson and Rachel, leaving Morgan outside, engulfed in the cold night. Her final plea had gone unheard, and she was left to face the consequences of her actions alone. The sun filtered through the trees in the garden, casting dappled shadows on the grass. Dawson stood at the edge of the flower beds, watching his children chase each other around a large oak tree. Laughter filled the air, a sound that felt foreign yet welcome after the turmoil he had endured. Beside him, Rachel leaned against the fence, her presence calm and grounding. Dawson turned to her, a quiet smile spreading across his face. I never thought I'd find peace after what Morgan did. But now I feel like I have everything I need. Rachel looked at him, her eyes warm. You deserve this, Dave. You've been through enough. She squeezed his hand, a small gesture that carried a weight of understanding. As they stood together, the sound of his children's laughter echoed through the garden. 7-year-old Evie twirled around in circles, her hair flying out like a halo. Beside her, 10-year-old Nico pretended to be a superhero, zooming past her with imaginary capes. Dawson watched them with a sense of pride swelling in his chest. Look, Dad, I'm flying, Nico shouted, leaping off a small rock with a grin. Evie clapped her hands, cheering him on. Do it again. I want to fly too, Evie shouted, determination in her voice as she tried to mimic her brother. Dawson laughed, shaking his head. Careful, you might actually take off. Rachel joined in the laughter, her presence blending seamlessly into the moment. They're full of energy today. It's great to see them like this. Dawson nodded, watching as they raced across the grass, their carefree spirit infectious. After everything, I worried about how they'd handle it. But seeing them like this, I know they're going to be okay. Rachel turned to him, her expression serious. You're a good dad, Dave. You've shown them strength in the face of adversity. That's what they'll remember. He met her gaze, her words striking a chord within him. It's hard not to feel like I failed them when Morgan left. I thought I'd ruined their lives. You didn't ruin anything. You've given them stability when everything else fell apart. They have you. Rachel's voice was firm, reassuring. And they have me now, too. At that, Dawson felt a warmth spread through him. I'm glad you're here, he said, sincerity in his voice. It means more than I can express. Good, she replied, grinning. Because I'm not going anywhere. Dawson watched his children, laughing and tumbling over each other, and he felt a shift within himself. The weight of past betrayals was still there, but it was no longer suffocating. Instead, he felt a new lightness, the promise of a fresh start. Hey, kids, he called out, and they paused, turning to him with bright smiles. How about we take a break and grab some lemonade? Yay! Evie cheered, racing toward him. Nico followed, still pretending to be a superhero, striking poses as he ran. As they headed to the picnic table in the shade, Rachel grabbed a pitcher of lemonade from the cooler. The sweet, citrus scent filled the air, mixing with the fresh smell of grass. Did you guys have fun today? She asked as she poured the lemonade into plastic cups. Yes, Nico exclaimed, practically bouncing in his seat. We're going to fly to the moon next. Can I come? Rachel asked, pretending to be serious. Of course, Evie replied, her eyes wide with excitement. You can be our co-pilot. They all laughed, and for a moment, the garden felt like a safe haven, a world untouched by the pain of the past. Dawson sipped his lemonade, watching his children chatter and play with Rachel, feeling a sense of belonging that he thought he had lost forever. Can we have a picnic tomorrow? Evie asked, her voice filled with hope. I want to bring sandwiches and cookies. Sure, that sounds like a great idea, Dawson replied, grinning at her enthusiasm. Maybe I can make my famous peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Nico added, puffing out his chest. Only if you promise not to get peanut butter all over your shirt, Dawson teased, and the children erupted into laughter again. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden rays across the garden, Dawson felt a sense of clarity wash over him. This was his new life, a life filled with laughter, love, and possibility. Do you think we'll be okay? Dawson asked Rachel quietly, the weight of his question lingering between them. Of course, she replied softly. You're creating a beautiful life for your kids. Just keep being you, and they'll be just fine. He looked at her, gratitude flooding his heart. Thank you for believing in me, Rachel. She smiled back, a spark of something deeper flickering in her eyes. It's easy to believe in someone who's trying to build a better life. In that moment, Dawson realized how much he had changed. He was no longer the man consumed by bitterness and regret. He was a father, a friend, and perhaps even a partner again. Let's make a promise, Dawson said, feeling a surge of determination. Let's promise to keep moving forward, to embrace this new beginning together. Rachel nodded, her expression earnest. I promise. The children ran around them, their laughter echoing in the warm evening air, the sound mingling with the gentle rustle of leaves. Dawson reached for Rachel's hand, intertwining their fingers, and together they watched as their lives unfolded before them. This was a new beginning, a chance to rewrite their stories. And as Dawson looked at the faces of his children, filled with joy and innocence, he felt a profound sense of hope for the future.